What has happened over the last couple of years is that we had the big recession happening, we had questions on budget happening, and obviously one of the primary areas to get impacted is testing. So most of the testing teams, most of the QA managers, directors, VPs get handed over the number by the CIO saying that, look, your budget is going to get cut down by 5%, 10%. Can't I use business analysts to test it? Can't I not test it and see how it is in production? So all sort of existential questions are coming up over the last 6 to 12 months. And interestingly enough, what has happened is that has not reduced the testing effort. Instead, the focus of testing has shifted from our plain vanilla end of life cycle testing to a variety of opportunities. Different organizations have taken different routes. We'll try and see some examples as I speak. And what I want to do today is see what is the impact, see how most of the organizations are trying to work around it, maybe take Agile as an example and see how we can mimic such a scenario, and then see what is impact in terms of transition, organizational impact, etc. Traditional testing is independent testing. It's focused on functional aspect. It focuses on existing as a discrete team and identifies defects. So development goes ahead, development builds things, and we test at the end of it. Now that has been the history. That is still happening in majority of the cases. Some of the industries like say technology, or say if you're a Google or a Facebook, you're probably way ahead of the curve and you have come up with all sort of innovative approaches, but 60 to 70% of the organizations follow this. Some call it Agile, capital A, small a, italics A, different varieties of Agile, but end of the day what happens is that testing waits for the development to hand over something, you do the testing and give it back. Now interestingly enough, there was a study last year done by QAI, and this was a result that came up. What does business want today? So I do the testing, I hand it over to the business, but what does business want? So it's slightly small, so I'll probably blow it up for you. So there are a variety of reasons coming out. You can see by the numbers coming in, but what is more interesting is the top 3. Business wants to reduce the risk. I push an application, I don't want any risk to my revenue stream. I want to respond fast. So I don't need to wait 6 months for something to go to production. I don't want to see a new business feature to come into production after 6 months. I want it tomorrow. So there is one organization that I know of, they have up to 10 releases every 2 weeks, 10 releases. Of course, they have 50% test effect, that's a different story, but they do focus on multiple releases. So business is demanding today that you have fast response and beat competitors. So if my competitor comes up with something, it's imperative that I follow. If JCPenney opens up something in Facebook, it has a sales channel in Facebook, it's imperative that Macy's also follows suit within a month or 2. So 3 core factors are now driving more than 60% of what business wants. And on the other hand, we have testing, which is waiting till the end of life cycle to get the. So what testing organizations have done is moved away steadily from a discrete testing unit to becoming a continuous and integrated testing unit. Now the question is, how do they do that? Agile is a well-known option. It's also a dangerous option. They also have other iterative options which few of the organizations have done beautifully. So I quoted Agile because that seems to be the fad. Many organizations try to adopt Agile, but I also want to emphasize that Agile is not the only solution. So anything which can help me push my tested code back to the development team or back to the business suffices. It could be an iterative model with a frequency of 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It needn't be an Agile with a sprint of 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Of course, if you do a pure Agile, if you have all the constraints of Agile taken care of, Agile beautifully suffices. Which also explains why you see so much or you hear so much about Agile these days, because somebody tells you that Agile works well, business comes and tells you that, look, you need to get these things done. You jump to Agile without understanding why we go for that. The core business motivation essentially being that I need to reply back sooner than later. organizations are now adopting what I call shift left philosophy. So can I shift my testing towards the left? Can I shift my testing towards the left of SDLC so that I can start testing from requirements? So this is not the traditional attempt at starting testing early where I capture requirements at the beginning. That needs to be done, but this is something much more than that. So you identify the QA skill sets needed at the beginning. You focus on options like test-driven development. In test-driven development, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, you have a set of requirements. You build a set of test cases suiting that requirements, and your code is tested against that. So your first run will always fail because you have nothing. Then the developers come and build something. You test it against the test cases. They pass. We are good. We go to the next one. So essentially, any incremental build that is coming into the hand of a tester is immediately tested, completed, signed off, and moved ahead. So end of the day, if I have a product which is built, say after say 6 weeks or 8 weeks of iterative testing, I have something which is already tested, it's already working fine. So you don't wait for developers to build n number of modules before you start testing. It's sort of testing dictates what the developers need to check in. So as a developer, if I check in something and if that doesn't pass against my test cases, I need to go back and fit it in again. Small point there about the proof of concepts. So aspects like performance and security has become increasingly critical now. So especially as I try to move things to the left, if I can find defects earlier in the life cycle. So if I have a design, can I validate it from a performance perspective? Can I validate it from my OWASP regulations perspective? And see if the design itself has some core constraint which can be caught now rather than waiting till my end life cycle. And the advantage here is that especially for a proof of concept, you don't need near production performance environment. So even if you're having a constraint from a performance environment, you can actually take your design modules, you can do a proof of concept on a small scaled down version and make sure that that works out well. And most organizations are now mandating it. In fact, they're calling it out as a separate organization, merging testing into the engineering stream and building out both from a performance and security perspective. And then early execution of QA, non-GUI testing. So traditional testing focuses on UI. So I use a tool, say if I'm doing automation, I use QTP, I do a record and playback, I run it. We now probably need to look at the next layer. So if I'm building, say let's take an example, if I'm building a 3-tier application, I need to test each of my tiers upfront rather than waiting till end of the day to do a GUI based testing. Of course, GUI based testing has to be done, but probably at the end of the day as part of my regression testing. During my iterations, I need to test each of my components. And then finally, when I do my regression testing, I do it from an automated perspective. And if I take an organization like say, let's take any of the major organizations, let's take Facebook or eBay or Google, their regression automation is greater than 90%. So the advanced organizations, most of the technology organizations I'm speaking about, have moved away from the target being regression automation percentage. Their target now is focused on functional automation percentages. They already reached north of 90% for my regression automation, and they're now focusing on how can I automate this early life cycle execution using different tools. So we'll touch upon the tools in a couple of slides. So what does this mean in terms of testing approach itself? So I call it inverting the triangle. Now if I take a traditional testing approach, as most of you will be aware, you have a little bit of unit testing, say 10 to 15%. You have a little bit of service layer testing, especially web services since the last 3 to 4 years. There has been increased focus, so let's say 25 to 30%. And then we follow with a massive UI based testing. If I need to test ahead of time, early in the life cycle when things are getting built up, we need to probably invert that. I need to insist on a greater percentage of unit testing, probably 35 to 40%. I need to insist on a greater layer of service layer testing. Each component has to be tested ahead of time, and then close it off with a set of GUI testing, which focuses on end-to-end business flows. So instead of using my UI testing to identify defects which might occur in each of the individual components, I am using my UI testing to identify if there are any critical defects from an end-to-end flow perspective. So now, refer back to the earlier information I said, you have unit testing done, You have the service layer testing done, and you have functional testing. Of course, automation is needed for functional testing as well. And from a QA approach perspective, you have regression testing, you have your beta testing, and you have your user acceptance testing. So split the two logically. Maybe you can choose to have two separate teams to drive it, or you can choose to have a greater collaboration with development teams where the unit testing is driven by the development teams with QA checking what is output, but much more than what has happened earlier. So earlier development team will do the unit testing. If you're matured enough as an organization, you insist on seeing the user testing logs, sorry, unit testing logs, and go ahead. What I'm saying is one step beyond that. Unit testing has to be framework driven. Unit testing has to be reusable. We'll see a bit more of that in a couple of slides. And then we have the whole QA approach, which is, if you see, the more traditional approach that is being followed here. So we are moving away from your requirements identification, test case creation, system testing, integration testing, regression testing. The whole system testing and integration testing is sort of getting split into multiple components, and then with each of them having different skill set needs. That is today. What is increasingly happening further on the QA side essentially is that this is fast merging into a crowd-aided community testing. So for those of you who attended my earlier session, I was speaking specifically on the crowd testing aspect of it, where what is happening is that today, if I have user acceptance testing done by business, in some cases aided by the vendor who comes and gives you a set of test cases, you try to execute it. Some organizations do some dog fooding, do some beta testing. It's moving fast towards an area where this is merging into a crowd plus community testing, where you're using the global population to come and test few portions of your applications in a controlled fashion, using internal channels influenced by social media. Examples would be Quora and AdWords, and try to move towards a community testing. And what happens is that, or what I'm predicting will happen is that UAT as it stands today and beta testing as it stands today will probably give way to community testing over a period of time. So if I compare the team today, which is our QA team predominantly consisting of manual testers, focusing on executing test cases created, their work is now limited to just regression testing. And if I'm automating 90% of my regression tests because of timeline pressures, you can infer for yourself where that skill set need lies in the future. So you don't need them. Or if I'm a tester who knows only manual testing, it's probably time I went back to community college. So what most organizations are trying to do now is that they're intensely focusing on training their existing QA folks to become QE folks. And because they already know the tenets of QA, because they already know how to test it, it's much easier than one would think. So you don't need to be as proficient as a test or as proficient as a say a development architect to do QE. All you need to have is a common mindset and accepting the fact that these are things that have to be done. So net effectively, as we go ahead, we are seeing a shift where testing is split into QE plus QA, where QE is focusing more and more on service layer testing, increased focus on automation, be it functional automation or regression automation, and your plain vanilla manual testing, UAT, etc., evolving into social media aided community testing.